Welcome to the FML podcast, the podcast on a mission to uncover actionable insights, explore the latest trends, and to catalyze your fintech's growth. Join Growth Gorilla's founder and managing director, Shameer Sachdev, and some of fintech's hardest hitting marketers and leaders.
Welcome everyone to today's episode of the Fintech Marketers and Leaders podcast. Today we're joined by Andrew Davies, Chief Marketing Officer at Paddle. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me today.
Total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As I always start these conversations, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey so far and how you ended up at Paddle?
I went to university with one goal, which was to start a business and be able to go into my own job at the end of graduation. Very fortunately, and after multiple failures, was able to do that, and ended up building a software business that we sold in 2019, and worked for the acquirer for a couple of years as we bought a bunch of other companies, and on that journey also ended up advising a whole bunch of other SaaS, mostly Series A, Series B businesses on the go-to-market, and one of those was Paddle. And then they invited me to jump on board as their CMO, which I did, and have absolutely loved my last couple of years here. So I actually joined about 18 months ago, but was doing a little bit of advisory work before that. And so almost coming up to my 2-year mark. And the business has transformed in that process through another big fundraise, a big acquisition, and lots of maturing as we grow up and serve thousands of software companies by being a core subscription, payments, and tax compliance platform as they scale globally.
Amazing. I was just about to ask you, do you mind sort of taking us through who Paddle are and what you guys do? So who is your target customer? Who's your perfect customer?
So we often serve SaaS businesses from their first dollar of revenue. And so it's often a technical founder, although what we're selling them is something financial. It's solving payments issues, tax compliance issues. As those companies grow, we increasingly find we're selling into a CFO, and then as they grow even bigger, we're selling into a financial controller. But our businesses can be as small as someone bootstrapping a SaaS business in their bedroom, all the way up to hundreds of millions of revenue. And obviously, how they make those decisions changes as they grow. But yeah, that's our core product. And then we acquired a company called ProfitWell last year, which also gives us a free metrics platform. So you can plug in any other payments system into it, billing system into it, and get a free metrics dashboard, benchmarking, much more detailed MRR, churn, unit economics. Also, one of their product lines was a retention business, helps you automatically retain involuntary churn. And then thirdly, Price Intelligently, which is one of the leading SaaS pricing consultancies on the market that does quant pricing studies for hundreds of the top SaaS businesses globally.
On the Paddle side of business, you say you've got a complete payment solution. A lot of businesses say that, and it means a lot of things. When you say complete, can you kind of give us a view as to how complete? I mean, is it end to end?
It's complete for the bit we solve, which I guess is probably how most people describe these things. We have two fundamental guiding principles as a business. One of them is that we want to be the most helpful brand in SaaS, and we can talk about our content and media and benchmarking and stuff later on. The other is that we want to do it for you. And there are lots of tools, SaaS tools, that help you manage better, price better, forecast better, whatever it might be. We want to remove that complexity from the founder, take away that risk and that complexity from them. So we actually operate as what's called a merchant of record model, where we're kind of an intermediary between the SaaS business and their customer, which means that we take legal liability and title for that sale, which means we're the one that's liable for tax in every single jurisdiction they sell in. And we have to optimize the payments and all of that process, and we have to do the reporting. And so it's complete in that sense, in that you can build a product and then you can use Paddle and you can sell in a compliant and safe and optimized way everywhere in the world from day one.
There's already things that you've kind of spoken about that I want to jump into. And you talked about, obviously, the different types of customers that you have and I suppose the decision makers involved in that process. So I suppose to kind of start off with, you've landed in your role at Paddle 18 months ago, coming up to 2 years. What's been your approach to owning marketing at Paddle? And I suppose, how have your previous ventures influenced your approach to marketing at Paddle?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things that are different at Paddle. Everyone thinks their company is a snowflake, unique from everyone else, but there are a few things here different to the businesses I've been involved with previously. Fundamentally, the go-to-market process is one of, understanding where you play, why you win, making sure you deeply understand that target customer, making sure you've got a message that matters, making sure you've got a range of channels and tactics you're testing to engage them, and off the back of that, building something that's memorable, repeatable, and able to scale. And we can talk about all the pieces of that. But as I walked into this business, most of my previous work had been involved with selling to enterprises and to selling to people who weren't like myself. One of the things I love about Paddle is we're selling to software founders. I've been a software founder, whereas in my previous roles, I was selling into people who had job titles and organizational sizes that I'd never really worked in. And we were usually doing, pretty whale hunting, ABM outbound type processes. Whereas at Paddle, we've got a hybrid go-to-market motion. So we sell outbound, but we also have a product-led growth motion where you can come without ever talking to a human, read our dev docs, sign up for what we do, go into the sandbox, build out what you want to build out, and go live and transact after you've gone through our risk processes without ever speaking to someone. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that's different there, moving from sales-led to sales and product-led. Secondly, I think going from selling to large customers where there's a sophistication and a process of how they buy to companies that are very small and often they don't know how they buy. This might be one of a few purchases they make in the early days, AWS and Paddle and a few other things. There's not much that they purchase. So there's real immaturity around how they buy. The third thing that's really interesting for me is that in most businesses I've been involved with, you are selling some form of license, whether monthly, annual, or multi-year. Whereas we're on a take rate for our primary kind of billing product, although we charge in different ways for the other products. So we have a take rate of the underlying customers we serve, and so we are entirely aligned with their success. If they grow, we grow. If they don't grow, we don't grow. And that's really interesting because it enables us to invest in long-term success with our customers in a way and benefit from that in a way that many other businesses can't. So those are just a few things that, are different and obviously, a range of experiences that I'm bringing to the table here. But I love the process of learning in every role. And there's certainly a lot of learning here.
Just to sort of really dig into sort of these sort of areas of thought, how are you approaching, I suppose, the large versus small customers? How are you approaching, well, obviously sales-led is obviously sales-led, but from the product-led perspective, how are you approaching that? How are you driving people into the site and taking them through that journey?
I would say that there's probably 3 different ways that a customer chooses and buys Paddle. There are, founders at the early stage who have heard about us or are on their second or third company and therefore know the benefits of it and just want to go with it, who come in. There's no buying group. It's a single person or 1 or 2 people making a decision, and it's just get going. Then you've got companies that are doing maybe $500,000 or $1 million of ARR or a couple of million ARR, are starting to hit tax thresholds around the world and realize that they're non-compliant and therefore are getting tax fines, etc. And they Google for how they solve this, and we'll be one of the very first things that come up. And so they join a webinar, read some content, and then we talk to them. And we'll also be outbounding to that set of customers as they hit those kind of revenue marks. And then finally, there's a much more complicated set of customers that does look more like my prior enterprise sales processes, where they probably are on an existing but incumbent merchant of record. So they're selling via one of the old school MORs. They understand that model well. They're quite sophisticated, but it's not good for the future. And that's when it's a displacement, and we've got to get in there and show how we're as robust, but with a much more modern experience. And so, 3 very, very different approaches. And that's really challenging. And then in terms of your question on kind of the range of tactics we use, we've got an interesting mix. I don't think much of this is rocket science, but I think really about our products as a set of concentric circles. And on the outside, we've got our content, Paddle Studios, our written content, our podcasts, most of which is episodic, but then also some of it is one-off in multiple different formats where we are genuinely trying to help the SaaS industry grow better, faster, safer, with the belief that if we do that, then that'll come back to us in value over time. So that's the first piece of it. And then, clearly we'll be, we're going and meeting founders all over the world. The best founders, the best target customers of ours are usually from small domestic markets, so they have to internationalize early and have to face these issues of currencies and tax issues early. And so we fly into a whole bunch of countries and go and have dinners with them. So, over the last few months, we will be in the next few months, we will be in, Amsterdam and in Bucharest and in Cluj and in thinking about got Munich planned and Hamburg planned, thinking about Chennai and Bangalore. I was in Tel Aviv last month, and then in the US, obviously San Francisco and Austin and Boston and New York and Chicago. So a lot of it then is going and meeting people face to face around those small dinner formats where we're bringing some data and then having a conversation with founders and finance leaders and go-to-market leaders. And then there's the whole other mix of programming in terms of webinars and then a DG function, an outbound function. We can dig into any of that that's interesting. But for me, the most important thing is to deeply understand our target market, because I think that almost every tactic works when you know who you're going to try and win in a really, really individualized and well-understood way, in a really intimate way.
It's really, really interesting, and yeah, look, I'd absolutely. There's so much of that I want to dig into. I kind of want to start off with, I suppose the content stuff and Paddle Studios. So one thing you mentioned, obviously, you've got people searching for solutions. So I'm assuming, obviously, that this is, you've taken the time to see what your target customer is searching for, and creating content around that to serve to them, either via obviously organic means or via paid means, and then getting them into the site. Is that kind of the general gist?
Yes, there's definitely a bunch of that. But I think what we do is really interesting in going beyond that on the media strategy. So the company we acquired, ProfitWell, the CEO, the founder there was Patrick Campbell, who is well known in the SaaS industry on the topics of pricing and retention. And was a very early pioneer in a media strategy for a business. And so when we think about that, what I would break it down as is we're creating multiple different formats of content that are thoughtful, so they stand out because they really resonate with the audience, and they're of high production value. So we're going beyond what a normal B2B company would do, but also critically they're episodic. And I think something that's really interesting about episodic, this podcast being a great example, is that number one, there's this payoff that comes time and time again because you're constantly putting more wood behind the same arrow, the same set of topics, and you become known for that. There's followership around that. I think something also happens in that you become remembered for that topic. And so, in our mix, in our slate of shows, inherited from ProfitWell was a show called Pricing Page Teardown, where Patrick and another exec would look at the pricing page of a big PLG SaaS business and rip it to pieces, break it down, find some learnings. That has thousands of people who watch those episodes because every time we release one, there are some new insights on pricing. Now, we don't need to get everyone excited about pricing pages. What we do need is to make sure those who are making pricing page decisions and pricing decisions for their business, they have a place to go and learn. And now there are pricing leaders in the product marketing and product teams of most SaaS businesses who will know of our content as a result. Churning Point is the same for Retain. We have a CFO podcast called Beyond the Budget, and we're just playing with more and more of those episodic formats, and also thinking about how we can use that not just as a brand play, but also in demand gen too. And we can dig into that if that's interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a couple of companies that I think do the content strategy piece really, really well. Paddle's definitely one of them. I think, 11FS, we all know the Fintech Insider podcast. I think they've done that really, really well. And, we regularly have conversations with B2B organizations, and, I feel like we're forever spending, time trying to explain to them the value of this, but you've done it so eloquently. I do want to talk about the demand gen stuff, but I just want to make sure I don't miss anything off. You also mentioned about, I thought what was really interesting was that you mentioned about going into territories where that the founder or the company needs to internationalize early. And I think that's a gem of information that you have there. And I almost want to just dig into, how did you surface that piece of knowledge? Was that just looking through data? Was it anecdotal, or did you conduct market research to surface that?
A bit of everything. Whenever you're selling a product or a service, there'll be a huge market, a TAM, a total addressable market that you can serve. Then you break that down and think, who are the serviceable addressable market? Who are the people who can really buy from us right now? And then you can go one stage further with SOM, with serviceable obtainable market, given your current resources and constraints. I think what's really interesting, and what we did at Idio really successfully, was not just look at these other people we can sell to, but who has the biggest pain and is able to pay for what we're selling, and thinking really carefully about not just the list of companies we can sell to, but the list of companies that have this pain and can have the biggest turnaround in fortunes as a result of our product or service. And so when we think about that from Paddle's perspective, thousands, tens of thousands of software businesses in the US, but most of them will be selling via a sales-assisted method, and their main growth process will be about selling to bigger and bigger companies. They go up market because they've got a huge domestic market, and that's all they need to do. Internationalization is a problem for the future. Whereas if you're in Bratislava, it's highly likely that you're selling probably via a product-led approach. So you've got a checkout on your site and you're selling to users rather than to economic buyers. And suddenly you're going to exhaust the Bratislava buying community extremely quickly, and you've got to launch and sell in other countries. And so you've got to think about translation, about multiple payment methods, other forms of localization. So, I think it's very intuitive that that's where we end up going. The interesting piece is, how do we find and how we size those markets? Because they're often very small businesses in areas where there's less data coverage. And that becomes a really interesting data gathering, data modeling challenge, which we've got the team focused on all the time to make sure we're understanding where these companies are and how we can have conversations with them as early as possible.
The listeners that we do have listening to this podcast, there'll be a few sort of thinking there going, well, I don't have a team that I can dedicate to doing all of that for me. And I suppose the question they would then want to ask is, or would like me to ask is, if I have a smaller organization, yes, it's B2B, how do I tackle that problem, bearing in mind, a lack of resources or not as much resources as say Paddle has? How would you perhaps, handle that?
I believe it is especially in the early days, it is a founder level problem to understand the size of the opportunity in your market and how to prioritize it. And I don't think you should be delegating that to, some person junior in your go-to-market team. To the point where with Idio, even up until the point we got acquired when we were 60 people, it was still a founder level sign off whether a company was allowed to be sold to by our sales team, whether we would devote any budget, any time, any minutes of the day thinking about them. Because we believed that we'd gone and done the research that said that these people, hand on heart, can make the maximum value from our product. And whether they want us or not, like us or not, we don't care, because we know over time we're going to sell to them, because there's these points of need and there's these firmographic and technographic signals that say they should be using Idio for their go-to-market. I hear what you're saying about smaller organizations, but I believe this is one of the first priorities of a go-to-market focused founder. How big is the size of the prize? Where is it? How do they cluster? If we've got multiple, perhaps we're a horizontal product, how we can sell into multiple different places. Well, maybe we need to run some, testing into those different places to find out which cluster is going to be most effective right now. And I'd much rather, in the seat of a founder, have difficult conversations with investors about a small market we're going to go and serve than to find myself wanting or not understanding that market intimately enough. And so I think it's about making that target market as small as possible, for especially in those early days where you're testing. So you actually get feedback, results that matter, rather than just a genuine MQL number that means nothing to you in terms of whether there's a size of prize you can go after.
The other thing I wanted to speak about as well is that you mentioned, obviously, kind of going on from that, and you mentioned about visiting these countries and actually meeting with these decision makers. And you listed off a whole host of territories and countries there. And you mentioned doing sort of smaller gatherings, I'm assuming sort of like round table events or something similar. So I suppose it's a two-part question. One is, getting a salesperson or a team over into a territory is costly. And second of all, that requires some commitment from obviously, the user that you're trying to sell into there. So how do you create that demand that that you're going to be able to put on a good showing if you fly your team out to Chennai or whatever? What's the bait that you're getting to get these founders in to come and speak to you and sit at the table with you?
Even in a hyper-competitive marketplace, I believe this need for people to gather with people that look and sound and experience things like them so they can learn is underserved. And so if you think about my role or your role, right? there are a whole bunch of people across the country and across the world that are doing the kind of role you're doing. And if they were people that you respected or a bit beyond you in revenue or were doing something interesting behind you in revenue, you'd want to sit at a lunch table and learn from them and ask them general questions. So would I. And so, I think the first thing is that I think that need of being gathered in a physical space around interesting conversation with people like me, I think that is still underserved. Then I think there's just a massive difference between a thoughtless go somewhere, put some money behind a bar, have some conversations with people, than there is with saying, okay, firstly, how do we get enough people in that locale who know each other to feel like when they get into that room, they know this is a room for me. We want someone when they walk into one of our dinners or lunches to say, look around and go, I can learn here, rather than, what have I just signed up for the next 2 hours? I'm going to be sitting here dull and bored. So I think that piece is really important. The second piece then is, to your point, what are we bringing that's of value? None of our target buyers are willing to turn up for a dinner. That's not enough. It needs to be much more than that. And so the way we do that is we have access to 28 billion of SaaS data, payments data, billing data, and so we take a cut of that and we research through it and we come up with growth tactics, retention tactics, and we say, okay, we're going to have looked at 34,000 companies to find out a few things that the outliers are using to win. And we're going to come and we're going to spend a couple of hours over dinner, and we're going to spend an hour digging through some of that data and doing Q&A around it, asking for your thoughts, your challenges. And then you'll have a chance to meet some of your peers and learn from them. And that's just a format for us that works. It might not work in every listener's scenario. But at Idio, when we were selling into enterprise marketers at big wealth management companies and at big institutional asset management companies, we'd go and rent the Capitol Grill in New York and invite all of them together. And again, maybe it's leaning on someone in your space that's got influence, other partners you can be doing it with. I feel the playbook there is reasonably simple, but is hard to get right with all of those elements of value. And the other piece is, I just don't think it has to be expensive. I think you can fly into most of these cities for a few £100s. You can stay in a hotel for a couple of £100. You can buy dinner for everyone for £1,000, and you're out. And all it takes in any of our scenario, or in most of our scenarios, most of the listener scenarios, is one deal or a couple of opportunities that come out of that, and the whole thing is funded. And for us, we have a very clear, understanding of the number of opportunities per, investment that we need to get. And as long as we're holding ourselves to that, then we feel it's a tactic we can keep on using.
You've obviously settled on a tactic that works for you. Just out of curiosity, have you sort of tested out and tried the bigger events, or was it sort of, you went straight in with the round tables, you got traction there, and you've stuck with it?
No, we sponsor the biggest SaaS trade shows as well. We'll have booths at SaaStr and SaaSdoc. We're big sponsors of both of those events. And we've tried running and will continue to try running bigger events ourselves too. So this is a process of constant experimentation. The smaller field type events, they get that regularity. And what I love about them is I learn in every one of those rooms. So even if we didn't get an opportunity out of one of those engagements, I walk out of it, or whoever's leading it walks out of it with feedback, with understanding, with a push on the context of those individuals and their market. And that's valuable in its own right.
You talked about, I suppose, the quality of content that you're producing. And you specifically use the words, we put more effort and we do a higher value than a typical B2B firm. And I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. I think, can you kind of talk us through sort of perhaps examples or the types of content where you've kind of demonstrated that? And then I suppose, secondly, how have you demonstrated ROI in that kind of extra effort that you put into the quality of content that you're producing?
One of the things I think it's really important to understand when you're adopting this type of strategy is the talent that sits behind it. So we've got a production team that are from an arts background, they're from a creative background, and that's one of the real things we bring to bear. You mentioned 11FS as another example. Ben Enzor, who's the head of research there, they hired out of Forrester. I remember working with him when he was running the financial services practice for Forrester Research. Someone who's extremely capable of doing research and analysis and reporting on top of the data sets that they're using. And we can talk about a whole bunch of other software and fintech examples where they've hired in people who are able to add that narrative onto what they're doing. And then you've got things that would class perhaps more as edutainment. And so one of the fun things that we did recently was we because we solve tax compliance and payments globally, we thought it'd be fun to send a device into space and film it to prove that we can now do the same thing in space. The quip was around, solving payments and tax compliance for the ISS as well as every territory on Earth. And that was a fun process, right? We had a bit of, we had some actors that came in and we did it. It was a bit of an ad stunt. But what's really important to your note on ROI is the ROI of that wasn't, X number of thousands of views on LinkedIn and YouTube and other video channels. The ROI of that was that if we think about what we were doing there, it is entirely linked to our core value proposition. It's not some buzzy thing on the side. It's a clever way, an interesting way of exploring the fact that we help you scale globally. Wherever you want to take your software company, go there with Paddle, even if it's into space, right? Secondly, it plays on astronomy, rocket, geeky thing that many software founders have and geek out around. Thirdly, we were able then to execute that as an ABM process, as DG process. So not just we were getting loads of organic reach into our target market and also paying for reach into our target market. But then we did custom cuts of that video of people's specific logos going into space. We sent some swag up, some stickers and badges, and then put them on swag and sent them to people. And we generated millions of dollars of pipeline off the back of that video. And so what you saw on the front end was a nice, snazzy, kind of funny, cheesy video. But on the back end was real pipeline generation. Because I think many marketers, when they think about their video work and their social work and brand work in general, is they get stuck in this world where there's a false dichotomy between brand and demand. And I think every single interaction has the opportunity to not only build brand, change the thought patterns of their target audience, but also elicit action, generate demand from their target audience. And so many of the things we do, we want to do both at the same time. I can give other examples like when we acquired ProfitWell, we filmed a behind-the-scenes documentary about it. Yes, it was an interesting brand thing that got loads of traction. It told our story well, but also we serve software founders who want to get acquired at some point. And so it was something that really spoke to and educated our target audience that we were able to then run pop-up showings of in different cities. So I think doing both of those things, the 1-2 punch of brand and demand in the same program, is something that's really important.
Yeah, I love you can kind of talk me through that demand gen piece and kind of what that looks like for you at Paddle.
In terms of what it looks like in Paddle from a team perspective, so I've got a bunch of different teams that I serve, the product marketing team, the demand gen team, which includes our BDR, SDR outreach teams, and then, our brand and creative teams and a bit of go-to-market as well. So there's a whole bunch of teams that are doing stuff. And what these brand and demand opportunities give us is the ability to all unify around a single lightning strike and make sure we move everyone forwards on multiple different levels. Because if those different teams are operating on singing off different hymn sheets, the damage is not just as big as if you could all move forwards together. So things like that acquisition video, things like the space campaign. We recently did a massive product launch, which was, it was a virtual event that was led by our product marketing team, but had lots of, had brand work beside it and had DG work alongside it too. And so part of it then is making sure these teams are working well together against that single lightning strike. And then out of it, really everything works if you deeply understand that target customer. So for any one of these different programs, it's understanding who is this for and why are they interested in Paddle? What's that next step they want to get to with Paddle? And all of us are trying to work together on making sure we're being inspiring, educational, entertaining at the front end, but it always links to some pain or challenge that company or that individual is facing, so that there's the right to speak with some form of more middle or bottom of funnel follow-up, like a sales meeting or a webinar that's going into more depth, or some developer documentation that they can dive into if they're interested, or whatever it might be. A lot of this is about making sure you work together, but then you've got a sequence of where that customer goes next if they're interested.
I've got a couple of questions that kind of spawn on from that. You talk about obviously having these teams, like you said, doing stuff. And again, I imagine that there's a lot of founders and CMOs listening to this that they're about to walk into their Series B or Series C and be about to get a chunk of cash, and they're thinking, right, we'd like to go in a paddlewards direction and build something like this. Where's the starting point? And I know that could be a podcast episode in itself, but as best as you can, how would one sort of kick that process off, and what would the ideal structure look like for you?
So the first place is always to start with, do we deeply understand that customer? And so anyone who's walking into a fundraise where they're going to suddenly have a slug of cash, the biggest danger is that you start executing without deeply understanding. And so whether that's working with a research partner, whether that's just doing your own survey work, whether that is just trying to get in front of 10 people, 100 people that look like your target customer to have feedback conversations, whether it's just executing on your first campaigns, but judging insight that you receive, feedback you receive as one of the key outputs. All of those would be, normal, acceptable ways of doing that. But holding yourself to the fire that, do you really deeply understand this market from a size, from a value, and from a preferences and interests perspective? And I often see in those early days, in a good, healthy culture, confidence is a preceding indicator of other forms of success. So rather than booking opportunities or other forms of marketing metrics, in the early days, are you hand on heart more confident about the market and opportunity or less confident? Are you more confident that you know all of the people in the market that could buy from you? Are you more or less confident that you've got a message that's really resonating? Are you more or less confident that you're exploring different channels that allow you to carry that message in a more repeatable way? And so I would always start at the customer. In terms of team, I think it really depends whether you've got this outbound sales approach or whether you've got a product-led approach. And I do see still all too many marketing functions that have a sales-led approach, a sales-led go-to-market for the overall business, that try and do marketing stuff without realizing that probably for the foreseeable future, the job of marketing is to serve sales. Like if you're not generating qualified meetings with people who could potentially buy, then, the rest is just fluff. And yes, a good website and good value propositions and a nice sales deck and, all the rest of it, some good market mapping build up to that. But your job is just to build pipeline, is to get people in front of your founders or your senior salespeople to start getting that process of learning and also pipeline creation. And so I think it's dangerous when early stage marketers start investing in lots of other fluff, unless there is the capital and the strategy to pursue something where you're building an audience for the future and you've got the confidence and the insight that that's the right thing to do, even if it doesn't turn into anything for a long period of time. And there are always, there's always important ways to break the best practice. But I do think just understanding your go-to-market model is probably, is the next thing after understanding the customer. Once you know the customer, how do you reach them? What's the best way of reaching them? How do they buy? How do they learn? Are they technical and want to do it themselves? Or are they in a complicated environment with a complicated product where they need someone to help instruct them and build a buying group around them? You want to be customer first there. So that's always the best place to start. And then for me, it's about the process of proving and disproving assumptions. So that might be forcing some paid traffic through the process. It might be getting your first 10 sales meetings and seeing what happens. It might be a whole range of different things. But understanding that actually the best thing you can get off that early stage is insight rather than revenue. Like you might close. I've been in a situation of closing some early deals and then being a crazy steer for the next year of the company before we realized that we got it wrong, because we just happened to get lucky with an early deal. And we thought that was the way. We thought it was data. And so recognizing the insight you get back from multiple of those conversations is probably the most valuable thing you can get in the early stage.
It's interesting that you mentioned, the role of marketer at the early stages is to build pipeline and serve the sales team. My marketing manager and I were talking about this, and we were having this conversation around doing sexy stuff for the sake of doing sexy stuff. And I think we're marketers by trade. Obviously we're an agency, and my marketing manager, obviously she's a marketer. And we always want to do cool, sexy stuff. But sometimes you've got to go down to the bare bones and go, well, what is going to contribute to the pipeline? And one of my favorite examples of this is, I think it was a company called Brex, and it was their go-to-market piece. They'd done the champagne campaign. Mm-hmm. And they literally, they went out when somebody raised money, they went and, sent them a bottle of champagne. And it's very unsexy. It's very unsophisticated in reality, but it got pipeline through the front door. But I think as a marketer, if you can ideate these things, and to your point around like the video with, putting the logos on it and putting swag on it and doing all of that sort of stuff, if you can get bang for buck out of that stuff, you're going to be held in very high regard by your sales team if you're building pipeline, which is what we're here for at the end of the day, right? So, yeah, totally. I think it's just, I'm always just very mindful of, are we doing this because we think it's going to be cool? Yeah. I see this a lot with B2C as well. We're going to do this great at-home campaign, buy panels on the tube, and you're like, yeah, but your audience doesn't take the tube. They live in Devon, so why bother?
Yeah.
I kind of want to talk a little bit about, I suppose the future of paddle. I'm kind of looking at the notes, and there's so much stuff that we haven't spoken about, and I feel bad for having not covered it all. But I think, what does the future look like for paddle moving forward? What are the plans for the next sort of 3 to 5 years? And kind of bearing in mind that I suppose your core audience being the SaaS, being SaaS, and VCs aren't being particularly forthcoming with funding at the moment. How does that impact you as your Paddle as a business, and does Paddle have views to kind of venture outside of that to combat against that?
Firstly, economically, us moving out of a zero interest rate phenomenon clearly has consequences across the whole industry. And for someone who's operating on a take rate of the industry, it has consequences for us too. If our customers don't grow as fast, then we don't grow as fast from existing business. The burden is more on signing new business to keep strong growth rates. So, it has consequence, and it makes sure that we have to be just really robust about our forecasting and how we're spending money to make sure that we're, investing for now and for the future in a way that, doesn't get us into a bad situation. Fortunately, we have capital, we've got great investors, and now it's just making sure we're wise stewards of that. In terms of what the future is for Paddle, I think there's a few things. Firstly, we've just released a massive update to our core product that's been 12, 18 months in the works. And it's quite rare. Many companies go through a complete replatform of their initial product. Normally happens between 8 and 12 years into their existence. All the principles you built it on just have changed. And most companies flatline their revenue through that process until they've got that entirely new platform. Fortunately, we didn't. We've been growing through that process, but we've now got real ambition, because what we've got now is an API-first billing platform that has got a great dev experience around it, great developer documentation. None of that was true 6 months ago. And so what it should enable us, and we believe it will enable us to do, is to sell frictionlessly via self-serve, via the product-led motion, to more companies than we have done previously. So it puts a greater burden on making sure our risk processes and our support processes operate at greater volume with less friction than if there was a salesperson in the room juggling those conversations. So that's one thing that's really important. We want it to be more frictionless to work with Paddle. We want bigger and bigger companies to be able to self-serve rather than have to engage in active conversations to troubleshoot. Secondly, we have got this kind of core very sticky product that's at the heartbeat of how lots of SaaS companies generate revenue. And we've now got a few other products that sit around that in a flywheel. We've got a free product that can be your entry point into the kind of ecosystem, into the flywheel. We've got the pricing product, the retention product. And I would foresee a world where we get better at, via partnerships or building or buying, other value propositions that sit around our core billing platform and make the most of what we've got there in order to provide more value to our customers. So that'll be the second thing. And then the third thing is that, we've talked a lot about content on this episode so far. I strongly believe that one of the best things we can do as a steward of the industry for our thousands of customers, and also for the tens of thousands of people we don't work with yet, is, be that most helpful brand in SaaS. Look at our data set of 28 billion of ARR and provide the best data-backed advice and insights and courses and accelerator programs and launch pads and collectives and events that are based on the data we're seeing in our partners, so that we help SaaS founders scale better, faster, safer. And so that's a third piece of it, which we just believe that betting on the ecosystem is our future, and building those pools to fish from in the future is part of where we're going.
Amazing. Andrew, it's been absolute pleasure speaking with you. Before I let you go, I'm going to take you through our quick fire round.
Yep.
What podcasts are you listening to at the moment?
Oh, gosh. So loads on the marketing and B2B side, like B2B growth, Content Briefly, others. A fun one for you. There's a UK comedian called Mike Wozniak, who's been on Taskmaster and a few other places. Mm-hmm. He recently, in lockdown, he moved to Exeter near me. And I found this podcast called the St. Elwick's Neighbourhood Association Newsletter Podcast, which is a parody of his local area that's actually called St. Leonard's. And he misnames it so that he doesn't get into trouble. And it's a podcast about kind of all the parochial, small-minded, myopic stuff that his locality talk about, and I love it, and have consumed almost every episode so far. And it's not just because it's local. I just love his style of humor.
What's your favorite fintech company or favorite fintech brand?
I mean, we're big partners and customers of them, but I think Stripe have just done a killer job over the last decade of just defining how you create a platform and a developer experience that gives founders the Lego bricks to build their future from. So we learn a lot from them.
Are there any books that you're currently reading or you would recommend?
Let me give you two totally different ones. So I mentioned Stripe. Claire Johnson, I think, used to be the COO there. She's written a book called Scaling People that I'm reading right now. And then when I'm on my off days, I enjoy reading kind of historical fiction, and Robert Harris is always a good one. So I recently just finished Active Oblivion, which is his kind of novel retelling, but historically accurate version of Charles I and the regicide and the pursuing of those who executed Charles I, which was fascinating.
What's the best bit of life advice that you've ever received?
Opportunity dances with those that position themselves on the dance floor.
That's brilliant. I like that. And last question, what's one thing that I haven't asked you that I perhaps should have asked you?
The question I often ask people is how can I help? Like, I love this space. I love helping go-to-market leaders. So if you want to ask me how can I help? Anyone who's listening to this who wants to bounce an idea off me or chat about a challenge they're facing, grab me on LinkedIn or Twitter or any of the events that I'm at. I would love to chew through your challenge, your context, learn from it, and add anything I can to it. That's something I love doing all day, every day.
Amazing, Andrew. As I said, absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Shameer.
The FML podcast is brought to you by Growth Gorilla. To find out how our marketing growth experts can boost your fintech's growth, head to growthgorilla.co.uk. And make sure to search for the FML podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Don't forget to click follow to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Growth Gorilla, thanks for listening.